has been proven, and it is now substantiated by the press, that Walace D. Muhammad is a provocateur, and it is he that brought about the rift between Malcolm and Elijah, and he, more than anyone, that brought the Nation of Islam to its right-wing trends, its neo-fascist trends. It is an interesting story, and it'll take some time for me to tell you. Decision of Walace Muhammad, leader of the world community of Islam in the West, to become an international evangelist for his organization is not surprising. It follows logically from the rightward drift of the group over the years. Muhammad Imam, our spiritual leader so-called of the organization once known as the Nation of Islam, or the black Muslims, relinquished his post as head of the group's day-to-day operations earlier this month. He is a staunch supporter of the Carter administration and the U.S. capitalist system as a whole, and leader of what was once the most influential organization in the black community, one that has been through a number of transformations since its beginnings in the 1930s. The Nation of Islam originated as an offshoot of the black nationalist Garvey movement. In its earliest days, the Nation of Islam sought to refute one of the main components of racism. Its programs emphasizing blacks were a separate nation and that black history did in fact exist were important alternatives to the notion that black history was merely one of savagery. Furthermore, the group leaders stressed the necessity of black solidarity with the freedom struggles of third world peoples worldwide. Much like Garveyism, this amounted to an initial radical rejection of the U.S. system and its capacity to end the oppression of black people. There occurred a major decline of the Nation of Islam and other black mobilizations in the 1940s. In this period, the NOI, or Nation of Islam, existed in relative isolation and concentrated on self-help programs and cooperatives. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the stirrings of civil rights and nationalism began once again. Several years later, a young prisoner was won to NOI, Malcolm X. Malcolm, the black revolutionary leader, was recruited to the group by an older brother while serving a sentence for armed robbery in Michigan. He rose to leadership within the nation soon after his release from prison in 1952. With his activism and brilliant oratory, Malcolm transformed the nation from a sect to a major voice of black discontent. Through rallies, meetings, street corner speeches, and publications of articles and journals, the black Muslims gained massive influence in the black community. The group's most important publications, Muhammad Speaks, was founded by Malcolm X. The group posed as an alternative to the nonviolent leadership of the early civil rights movement, much of which through its support to the two-party system, sellout. The Muslims articulated or voiced black America's sense of solidarity with the rising African and colonial revolutions, and above all the realizations that nonviolence could not stop racist terror, and that the possibility of real integration into the capitalist U.S. mainstream was impossible and undesirable. As the Muslim position was typically stated by Malcolm X in the 1950s, if the people in Africa are getting their freedom, then 20 million blacks here in America, instead of shouting hallelujah over what is happening 9,000 miles from North America, should study the methods used by our brothers in Africa and Asia to get their freedom. There are 20 million some blacks in America, yet suffering the worst form of enslavement, mental bondage, mentally blinded by the white man, unable now to see that America is the citadel of white colonialism, the bulwark of white imperialism, the slave master of slave masters, said Malcolm X. Elijah Muhammad, however, while supporting these militant positions, sought to gain black independence, and not primarily by the armed mobilization of the black masses, but by a process of black capitalist accumulation. This position led to de facto abstention from the ongoing civil rights struggles of the late 1950s and early 60s. In addition, the bureaucratic structure of the Nation of Islam provided a basis for the leadership's material privileges. Defense of these privileges became more and more the fundamental concern of those tied to the nation apparatus. These problems led to the 1963-64 split between Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X. As Malcolm summed it up, I didn't break with the Nation of Islam. There was a split. I felt the movement was dragging its feet in many areas. It didn't involve itself in the civil or civic political struggles. Our people were confronted by. All it did was stress the importance of moral reformation. When I found that the hierarchy, the leadership at the top itself wasn't practicing what it preached, it was clear that this was part of the program was bankrupt. Its national leadership was bankrupt of any moral worth. So the only way it could function and be meaningful to the community was to take part in the political and economic facets of the Negro struggle. And the organization wouldn't do that because the stand it would have had to take would have been too uncompromising and activist, and the hierarchy had gotten conservative. It was motivated by its own self-interest. Group thrust aside. After Malcolm's departure, the nation continued to grow in membership and influence. However, the group was thrust aside by militant blacks, initially by Malcolm's Organization of Afro-American Unity, OAAU, and later by the rise of militant black organizations, such as the Black Panther Party and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. But with the decline and isolation of these organizations, the black Muslims lost strength in the early 1970s in much the same way that the original Back to Islam movement grew with the eclipse of the more militant expressions of Garveyism in the late 20s. Many blacks, disillusioned by the Black Panther Party, joined the nation. This gravitation towards the nation was facilitated by the Panthers' own turn in 1969 to counter institutionalism. When the BP, the Black Panthers, began to create free breakfast for children programs, liberation schools, many black people saw this as what Elijah Muhammad had been doing all along. The nation, from the time of Malcolm's departure until the assumption of leadership by Walace D. Muhammad, Uncle Tom Sellers, in 1975, continued its course of attempting to gain black independence by the slow accumulation of small businesses such as bakeries, supermarkets, fish stores, clothing shops, and so forth. As Elijah had summed it up in point 5 of economic blueprint for the black man, observe the operations of the white man. He is successful. He makes no excuses for his failures. He works hard in a collective manner. You do the same. And as explained by leading minister Louis K. Farrakhan of New York City in 1970, who is now broken away from the Nation of Islam over the sellout policies of his brother-in-law, in a speech at the Congress of African People, Minister Farrakhan said, Muhammad says to you, unite with him in this effort to put you on the road to independence. What do you mean, Muhammad? Muhammad asked, how are you going to be independent with your mouth in the white man's kitchen? Muhammad is purchasing farmland to feed black people. We have thousands of acres here in Georgia, many thousands now in Alabama, in Mississippi, and several other states. What are you doing, Muhammad? I am trying to prepare a meal for black people so that the black people can feed themselves. This, in sum, was the program of the Nation of Islam, a program of black business development as being the true path for the liberation of black people, which is erroneous. Blacks can never succeed in the system. Most of their farm acreage has now been lost. Black businesses are going downhill. 80% loss of black business in the last 10 years. 80% of them have gone broke in the last 10 years. The finished result in the black nation, according to the Earl O'Fahey and the myth of black capitalism, is that you just can't find liberation through capitalist systems. In the context of capitalist America, that perspective for black economic development was utopian. How could small grocery shops and restaurants hope to compete with the giants of U.S. imperialism? How could Shabazz steak and takes compete with McDonald's and Burger King with their cheaper prices and massive advertising funds? The Nation of Islam business existence was above all a reflection of the political support and solidarity extended to these establishments in the ghetto. Their long-time inviolability, however, was revealed during the first waves of the 1973-76 economic recession. The economic crisis hit hardest among those upon whom Elijah's economic projects depended, the black workers and unemployed of the ghetto. We'll be continuing this perhaps tomorrow or another day on the Nation of Islam and its rightward turn. And we will be linking it to certain white racist elements of a Nazi nature. It has been proven, and it is now substantiated by the press, that Walace D. Muhammad is a provocateur, and it is he that brought about the rift between Malcolm and Elijah, and he, more than anyone, that brought the Nation of Islam to its right-wing trends, its neo-fascist trends. It is an interesting story, and it will take some time for me to tell you.